Hi, how's it going? My name's Dan, and in this video we're going to go through setting up LDAP as the primary authentication method for a BookStack instance. What I've got here on my screen is a fairly fresh BookStack instance where I've just gone in with the default admin user account, created a book and a page, and that's about it. I've got a LDAP system at the ready. I'm going to be using JumpCloud as a nice simple way to have an example LDAP system. And within here, I've got a couple of users, Barry Jacobs, Jenny Jenkins, and a LDAP account, which I'm just going to use almost as like a service account to provide the LDAP integration with BookStack. And also within here are a couple of roles, all users, editor, and wizards. And we'll come on to those a bit later on. But yeah, let's get started with the setup. So there's a BookStack documentation page that details this whole process. So you can generally follow this, and that's what we're going to be doing within this video. So to start off, we need to add a whole bunch of options to our .env file within BookStack. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy pretty much all of these and add them to my env, and then we'll go through and edit those. If I jump over to the terminal, right now I'm within my BookStack instance in the command line. If I ls, I'll see all the files that are in that top level folder of my BookStack install, and hidden there is the .env file which we need to edit. I'll use Vim to edit that. And then we see the .env file. So we'll add everything that we just copied to the bottom of here. So let's paste that all in here. And then I'll jump up to the top of the options. So the first one is auth method equals LDAP. That just activates auth method and the LDAP auth method. By default, this is standard, or if you don't have it enabled, so if we comment it out with a hash, then that's just a normal authentication system that uses email and password. But by having that active, it sets it to LDAP. And you might need to jump between them, especially during setup, which you might see in a bit. Next up is the LDAP server. The port is optional. So I'm going to go to my JumpCloud documentation to find the default LDAP hostname. And then I'm going to use that. I don't need to add a port because using the default one here. I'm going to be using this with TLS to encrypt the communications to the LDAP system, which by default is just done by defining the server hostname like that with no port in most cases. Might depend on your exact setup. This comment here does say about adding it over SSL, but to be honest, that's not fully supported within BookStack. It's mainly TLS because that is the most modern way of doing encrypted connections via LDAP. LDAP S is kind of outdated at this point, is little used. You're going to more often be using the TLS option if you can go down that path, and we'll see that option down below in a second. And now the base DN for our instance. So I'm going to again jump into JumpCloud, and I can get that from looking at one of my users. So basically, what's the top level DN path that you want to be looking within? I'm going to choose this as effectively our root point within the directory. And now the DN and the password that BookStack's essentially going to act as when it searches the directory for users. I'm going to get rid of this, and then I want the whole one because this LDAP account is essentially my bind user account. And then let's add in their password. There we go. The next option is LDAP user filter. So this is the filter that BookStack's going to use when it's looking to find a user upon login. So it's got within here is a template parameter, so this $curly brace user. When this is kind of ran, when the login is ran and BookStack looks up to the LDAP system, it's going to replace this placeholder parameter with the username that the user has provided. And that's how it looks up to the system. So if you were expecting to match on email, for example, instead of doing UID, you'd probably want to change that to email. But in my case, I'm going to keep that as UID because that's exactly what my my LDAP system uses. They use the property UID as a unique identifier. A note on Active Directory, which is pretty popular amongst our user base. We do have special Active Directory settings shown down here, which are the most common options for Active Directory setups. So you probably want to follow that as the defaults if you're not too sure. Because some of these are quite Active Directory specific, especially this ID attribute. It needs to be in a certain format for things to work. We'll just crack on with our non-Active Directory setup. So yeah, we're going to use user ID. And this is also a place where you could add on other filters. So you could put on another filter condition here to only look within a certain group or something like that. So you can expand this out as needed. But we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to look up by UID and match that to the username that the user's entered. LDAP version 3, as it says there, it should be 3 in pretty much all cases. Other LDAP versions are pretty old, but it's there to configure if needed. But if you're not sure otherwise, leave that as 3. The ID attribute. So this is telling BookStack what property to use when it looks someone up and fetches their record. What property do we store within BookStack to re-identify that person on the next login, or to make sure we're storing people in a unique manner, or how do we match up their LDAP record with BookStack users in the future? So again, we're going to use their UID because we know that's going to be unique. But again, if you wanted to map everything on email, so you might want to change that to mail. And as I said, look at those Active Directory settings because you want to use the GUID that it provides. But we'll leave that as UID. And again, similar thing for the email attribute. So what attribute do we want to use for mail? So I can have a look here in JumpCloud documentation. They provide a nice example of what comes back. And I can see it comes back as a mail property. So I'll continue to use mail. And the same thing again for the display name. What property do you want to use as that person's name within BookStack? And within here, I can see the most appropriate probably is CN. And then, yeah, CN is the full first name and then last name as per this example. So I'm going to keep that as CN. But if you need another property as that person's name, this is where you change it. An LDAP thumbnail attribute. Unfortunately, I don't think JumpCloud provides the ability to come back with images, but I know Active Directory does. But in our case, let's comment that out to say we don't look up for a thumbnail avatar, and it does expect images to be provided as a JPEG binary data, which I think Active Directory does provide by default. But if you're using it with another system, that's something to consider. It has to be in the exact right format that BookStack's expecting there. So do we want to enable TLS? So I'm pretty sure JumpCloud does support it, so we'll say true to that to activate that. Do we want to go for insecure TLS? So this can sometimes be needed. We'll see if it's going to be an issue for us. But if the LDAP certificate provided when we do that TLS connection isn't within our host machine's trust store, then we might get issues when it tries to connect saying, hey, we found a certificate to try and use for TLS, but it wasn't supported. This option allows you to work around that, saying, yeah, allow TLS even if it's even the certificate doesn't look like one that we trust. But we'll leave that disabled for now. And then dump user details is a debugging tool that instead of continuing with the login upon login, it will just dump out the details fetched from the LDAP server and how BookStack passes that. And we'll come on to that in a second. Okay, I think that's everything that we need to configure for now. I'm going to save that. Then we'll jump back over to my instance. So again, I'm currently logged in as this admin user. If I refresh this, I'm still logged in because an admin level account will remain logged in even if you change the authentication method. I'm going to now choose to log out. Now let's try and log in with one of those LDAP users. Let's go for Barry Jacobs. Enter his password. So that's the UID that BookStack's going to use to match that up. Brilliant. So that's all worked fine. So it's brought us over. It's got our name, Barry, because that wasn't something that we put in one of the inputs. So it's got that from the CN that we defined. But if there are any issues in terms of the data that's coming across, or it's not putting something in, or saying we don't have an email, that's when we'd then use that debugging option. So if we go back into here, we'll remove the hash to uncomment this line. We'll say dump the user details. We'll save that file. Then when you log in with that option enabled, it will then dump out all their details to the browser. You don't probably want to have this on a production server. This is really only when setting up or when you're kind of in a debugging environment. But this can be a really helpful way to see exactly what's coming back from the LDAP system. So we can see here within this details from LDAP attribute, it just spits out everything that we fetched back. It won't show groups when configuring the groups for LDAP. That's something to consider. But this shows all the user level details. So we can go through here. We can see it's providing us UID, CN, mail, and DN properties. So if we look down here at the property details BookStack passed, this is showing us BookStack's interpretation of the LDAP provided details that's been passed out using the attributes configured within the .env file, the configuration that we just did. So it's basically showing how it's matched it up and what's come back out of it. So you can, for our purposes, this all absolutely is fine because the UID, B. Jacobs, name, Barry Jacobs, email addresses got out. But then if any of these are null, so we can see our avatar is null, but we chose not to map that up. But it may indicate that's where the issue is. You need to map that up correctly. Something to watch out for here, especially with Active Directory, is how the attributes are formatted. So no, in Active Directory, these attributes will be very long strings in like a style of a URL. There'll be a long URL within like mail, CN, and UID on the end. And when you're configuring the properties, the attributes within BookStack, those properties need to be the full URL within your .env file. It can't just be the mail on the end if it shows the full URL here, because it's just BookStack just mapping that based off the string provided by the LDAP system. So that's exactly match. So consider that if you see a really long URL in here, make sure you've got a really long URL in the attribute name within your .env file. So that's the debugging mode. Let's just disable that. I'll refresh this. I should be able to get back in. There we go. So that's authentication acting successfully. But now we're into this system and we don't have a option to go to the settings because we're not an admin user. And currently we can't log in as an admin user again because now we've activated LDAP, but now this is our only LDAP user and they're not an admin. So we need to try and figure that out somehow. So we can do that by going back into our .env file. And we can simply change the auth method. Just comment that out temporarily. And then when we go back to the login, it's back to our email-based login. And I'll just log in with that default admin account, and then we're back in. And then I will go in here and just change that back to LDAP. Cool, so if I go and have a look in our users, we now see Barry Jacobs, we can see his email address. Something to note is that you'll no longer, now we've saved the auth method back to LDAP, you won't see the password fields within the user profile here. So we can't update this person's profile because it's kind of redundant in an LDAP setting because the password is checked against the LDAP system. So that's completely missing, but what we do get as this added field is the external authentication ID. So when BookStack created this user, based upon the UID property that we defined, so let's just reference that quickly. The LDAP ID attribute, based upon that, BookStack's taken the value of that and stored that within the database along with this BookStack user. That's then used to match this user up with the LDAP system. So when a re-authentication occurs, when this person logs in again, it's going to look up to the LDAP system, it's going to fetch them back, and then once it's fetched the person back from the LDAP system and found B. Jacobs as their UID in this case, it's then going to look up to BookStack and then say, hey, is there anyone within the database that already has a external authentication ID of B. Jacobs? If so, it will match them up and log them in as that BookStack user. This can cause a little bit of trickiness, especially during initial setup. So if you've already got running with your BookStack instance, you've had email authentication running for a while, or even if you've just changed the email address on your own sort of admin account to be you, then what you might have trouble with is that once you change the authentication system and try to log in, it's going to fetch your profile from the LDAP system, but then it's going to try and create you because there's no matching account already within BookStack with an external authentication ID that is fetched. But it's going to try and create you, but you're then going to have duplicate email addresses, and then BookStack is going to be on the safe side. It's going to go, your emails match, but your external authentication ID doesn't match. So something seems wrong there. The data's not aligned. So for safety, we're going to not log you in, and it will show an error saying there's already a user in the system that has this email address. So that can be a bit tricky. So what you need to do, if you have such existing users, you'll need to come within BookStack, make sure the auth method is LDAP while you're logged in, and then change the external authentication ID for those users to match what they would be, or to match their ID that would come from the LDAP system. And once you've done that, then BookStack will then use that. So when they log in again, it can then use that value. It will see that there's already someone with that external authentication ID, and then it doesn't really matter about the email address at that point. It will just link up those users and then authenticate as this BookStack user account. If you've got a whole bunch of user accounts that you need to do that for, it can be quite a fiddly process, obviously going into each one of these. So it can alternatively be done by the REST API. Otherwise, this field is just a column within the users table within the database. So if you needed to, just be careful, but you could just go into the database and then run through the users table and update that for everyone in bulk where needed. So yeah, that's the authentication ID. Just it's good to be familiar with exactly the logic of what that does, because it's quite important when you have LDAP authentication enabled. Okay, but yeah, so we can see Barry logged in absolutely fine, but they have no roles, which is why we can see the settings once we logged in or anything else, because they don't have any privileges at all within the system. So there's a few ways we could get around that. So we could, now that we're logged in, we could just promote Barry here to be an admin, and then now that we can log in with Barry and then do all the admin stuff that we usually do. So we could manually manage the role here. I won't do that right now. Another alternative is within settings. You go down to registration, and then under enable registration, you'll see a message here saying this option doesn't really matter when LDAP's enabled, because we've kind of provide a seamless experience with LDAP where we just create them if they don't exist anyway, because it's really based on the LDAP system rather than a registration process through BookStack. So that option is redundant, but this option is still used. So the default user role after registration. So this is a single role that can be automatically assigned to any users or any new users coming through to a BookStack. So we can say in here, let's choose that as an admin. And now that's saved, we can go back into users. And what we'll do, we'll just delete Barry, as if he never existed within BookStack. Here we go, and we'll log out. And now if we log back in with Barry with that option set, we go in and we can see settings up here now. And we can go into see Barry, and then yeah, he's got that admin role ready set on there. So that is a nice, easy way to assign roles for new users coming into your instance via LDAP, which can work in a series of simpler use cases. But if you need anything more complicated, or you need something that works every time someone logs in, that might not be enough for you. In which case we have LDAP group to BookStack role syncing. And this syncing occurs upon login. And I should probably mention that any of this LDAP logic all runs upon login. So when we fetch people, when we look up people, when we sync roles, that always occurs when the user logs in. So nothing's kind of syncing in the background, or nothing's instant as well. So if you deleted someone within your LDAP system, it doesn't mean that BookStack user is then going to be logged out or anything at that stage. They'll stay in BookStack for the life cycle of their session. What it will mean is that if they are logged out and they try and log in again, that should then fail because they won't be found in the LDAP system. And that applies for groups as well. So if we delete a group, then it's not going to sync up with the BookStack role. But that aside, let's get into setting up a more complex group syncing system. So if we have a look at our BookStack roles, we've got a few. These are just the defaults. We've got admin, editor, viewer, and public. And then within our JumpCloud system, we've got all users, editor, and wizards. So to get going with the group sync, we can refer to the BookStack documentation. It's worth reading through this because it goes through exactly how the matching logic works for BookStack roles to LDAP groups. But we'll just go through this and I'll explain it kind of along the way. So it requires a few more options. I've just copied from the documentation and we'll paste those in. So the first one, LDAP users to groups. It's just a simple toggle of whether we want to activate it. By default, it's false, but by adding this option, we're setting it to true. And then the group attribute. What attribute do we want to look up for groups? In the vast majority of cases, this should be member of. Most things tend to use member of as a kind of the modern way of defining group membership when looking up users. But that is not always the case, but BookStack is expecting it in the format that an Active Directory system may give for the member of attribute. So I know for OpenLDAP, you have to provide this as an extra, like you have to install an overlay for OpenLDAP, but otherwise most systems seem to support member of without too much trouble. And then the option down here is LDAP remove from groups. So by default it's false, which means the group sync will work in an additive way only. So when it syncs, it will match up, find the person's matching roles within BookStack, and add those to their role membership within BookStack. When that's true, it will remove that user from any roles that they don't match up to. So it's a lot more dynamic. They can be removed. Obviously, that can cause a bit of awkwardness if you don't have your groups and roles matched up properly, because you might end up with someone without any permissions at all. But it's quite helpful if you need kind of an environment that works where you'd maybe want to remove someone's admin privileges. You can just do that within the LDAP system and have that occur within BookStack again when they next log in. But it just allows more dynamic setup rather than having to come in and then manage things by having that as true, it does make manual management quite a bit more tricky, because obviously any of those manual changes that you do to someone's roles, they could get overwritten when they next log in, because then it's all going to rely upon the role to group matching logic. For our purposes, we'll enable this though. So now that's saved, we can attempt to log in. So what I'm going to log in first is as an editor user. So this editor group matches up exactly with an editor role within BookStack in terms of naming. There is some normalization. I think BookStack will lowercase, then hyphenate between spaces to attempt to match up any namings. But those are exactly a line. And again, it will use the, in the group name of an LDAP group, it will use just the CN name. So we can, which is what JumpCloud will provide this group as. But yeah, we've got matching names. So if we try and log in, this time I'm going to log in as Jenny Jenkins. We have a look at the users within this group. It's got Jenny Jenkins in. Barry's also a part of it. Then we're logged in. And if we go to my profile, we can see we've got this editor group. We're also part of this admin group, which doesn't look initially right, but that will be because we've still got this setting enabled down here, and Jenny Jenkins was new. So what we'll do, we'll set this to none. We'll go back to users, and then actually we'll just log out, and then log directly back in as Jenny Jenkins. And then we can see we've no longer got that settings menu up here because we're not an admin user, and because we had that remove from group options enabled within our env config. So it's when we've logged in, it's matched us up. We're still an editor. If I go into here, I can still edit this page because I have privileges under the editor role, and we can verify that by looking on Barry's login still. So we'll have a look into users. We can see Jenny is still in here. Yep, she's in fact an editor, but no other roles are assigned. But yeah, it's removed us from that admin role because it didn't match that up when we logged in. So that's kind of the simpler case where you're just matching upon name. It becomes a bit more complicated where you can't match directly on name. So we've got this admin role, as we've seen before, and within JumpCloud, we've got this wizards. Imagine someone's created this and they're very protective over their fun naming, so we can't change wizards, but we don't want to change admins within BookStack either. So it's kind of, what do we do in this case? So within BookStack, we go back into that roles view, we'll click into a role. Much like on the user profiles where you see their external authentication ID, within roles you get this list of external authentication IDs. And I've actually put this in previously from a previous run. But within here, you can define some alternative name to use for this mapping. So instead of using admin to map up with our LDAP groups, we can instead use the term wizards. Again, refer to the documentation in terms of how it does this mapping, but it will kind of fetch these groups. This will come back, be lowercase, and match up with whatever we put in here. And if this matches, then it assigns us that role within BookStack. And you notice it's got external authentication IDs, so you can, if you wanted to, comma separate out and put multiple LDAP group names, which allows you to do a many-to-one mapping between the systems, which again can be really useful if you've got two different category of admins in this case within your LDAP system, but you want them just to be a standard admin role within BookStack. You can do that quite easily. So we'll leave wizards in there to do this this custom name mapping, and then let's tell you what, we'll just delete Barry, edit profile, currently admin only at the moment. Remember, we turned off the setting to assign admin upon login. So now we're back in the system. Barry Jacobs, and we can see we've got admin and editor privileges because that group syncing has worked as we expected. So yeah, that's how you can do group syncing. I will admit it can be a little bit tricky if if the groups aren't working as expected. There's not a whole lot of insight in terms of the groups that are coming from your LDAP system, especially if your LDAP system isn't returning stuff in that member of format that BookStack uses. If you're using a different platform, that might be something you need to check. But otherwise, it will generally work once you get a good understanding of how the name matching works. Then it's a fairly pain-free experience. But yeah, I think that's everything I've got to show with the LDAP setup. Again, I'll put a link to the documentation that we've got within the description of this video. If you have any issues, you can jump onto the BookStack Discord and ask some questions. Must admit, I'm personally not a massive expert in LDAP. My experience has mainly been through the BookStack implementation and helping people out with that. But sometimes it can be useful just to get another pair of eyes looking at your configuration if you get into a bit of a stuck point. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, and good luck with your own setup.